The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor of the ranch house. Outside, a winter storm was building, the wind howling like a wounded animal against the window panes. Jack Harlow sat in his worn leather chair, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. At 64, his face carried the lines of a man who had spent his life under the Montana sun, but his eyes still held a spark that belied his age. Across from him, his 18-year-old grandson Timothy sat forward in his seat, eager and restless, a young man on the cusp of leaving for college, seeking wisdom before venturing into the world. "Grandpa," Timothy said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "how do you find a good woman, the kind worth building a life with?" Jack's eyes crinkled at the corners, a smile playing at his lips. He set his coffee down and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the mantelpiece, where a faded photograph stood in a simple wooden frame, a young couple on their wedding day, hope etched plainly on their faces. "Let me tell you about the day I met your grandmother," Jack said, his voice taking on the rich, unhurried cadence of a born storyteller. "It was 1885, and I was a different man then." The story began to unfold, the present fading away as the past came alive in the warm, firelit room. Montana Territory, 1885. Matthew Hayes urged his Appaloosa through the deepening snow, the cold biting through his heavy coat. At 34, he cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and tall, with a face hardened by grief and the unforgiving Montana wilderness. His dark beard was flecked with ice crystals, and his gray eyes constantly scanned the horizon, a habit formed during the war that had never left him. 2 years had passed since he had buried his wife Rebecca and their infant son. 2 years of existing rather than living, of pouring himself into his timber business until exhaustion granted him a few hours of dreamless sleep each night. The Pine Ridge timber operation had grown under his relentless drive, now employing 15 men and supplying lumber to the Northern Pacific Railroad as it pushed westward across the territory. Matthew was returning from timberline with supplies loaded in his saddlebags when he spotted her at the crossroads known locally as Dead Man's Cross, a solitary figure standing in the swirling snow, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Her slight frame seemed bent by more than just the wind, and even from a distance the slump of her shoulders spoke of defeat. He slowed his horse, wariness mixing with curiosity. Strangers in these parts were rare, particularly in winter, and a woman alone was rarer still. As he drew closer, he could see she wore a threadbare shawl that offered little protection against the cold. Her boots were splitting at the seams, her skirts sodden with snow. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Matthew realized with a jolt that it was a child. He halted his horse 10 feet from her. The woman didn't flinch or step back, merely raised her chin slightly, a gesture of dignity that struck him unexpectedly. Her face was young, perhaps mid-20s, but her eyes held the weariness of someone much older. Despite the cold turning her cheeks red and her lips blue, there was a quiet pride in her bearing. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," Matthew said, his voice rough from disuse. The woman looked at him, her gaze direct, assessing. When she spoke, her voice was clear, though trembling slightly from the cold. "I'm lost." 3 simple words, yet something in the way she said them told Matthew she wasn't speaking of geography. There was a finality to her tone, as if she had walked to the edge of her world and found nothing but emptiness beyond. Matthew studied her for a long moment. Common sense told him to point her toward timberline, perhaps give her a few dollars for a room at the boarding house. It wasn't his concern, the stranger and her child. He had enough burdens of his own, yet something made him extend his hand instead. "Then follow me home." The woman blinked, surprise flickering across her face. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." Matthew dismounted and began adjusting his stirrups. "Can you ride?" "I can try. That's all any of us do out here." He looked at her directly, his gray eyes meeting hers. "Try or die trying. The land doesn't care about your past, only what you do today." He helped her mount, noting how light she was, how her fingers trembled with cold as they gripped his arm. The child made a small sound as Matthew swung up behind them, and the woman instinctively tucked the bundle closer, shielding it from the stranger at her back. "Name's Matthew Hayes," he said as they set off, the snow now falling more heavily around them. After a pause, she replied, "Elizabeth Coulter. This is Grace, if I am." Matthew nodded, though she couldn't see it. Storm's getting worse. My place is 2 hours east, but there's an old line cabin 20 minutes west. We'll shelter there till it passes. Elizabeth said nothing, but he felt her shoulders relax slightly, the first small surrender to trust. The old trapper's cabin appeared through the white like an answered prayer, low-roofed, with a stone chimney that promised warmth. Matthew dismounted first, then helped Elizabeth and Grace down before leading his horse to the small lean-to beside the cabin. By the time he'd secured the animal and grabbed his saddlebags, Elizabeth was standing uncertainly by the cabin door. "It's not locked," he said, nodding toward the door. "No one locks doors out here. Too few people to make it worthwhile." The interior was Spartan but sound. A dirt floor, a rough-hewn table with two mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove in one corner, and a narrow cot against the far wall. Cobwebs hung thick as curtains, and the air was stale with disuse. But the roof was intact and the walls solid against the wind that howled outside. Matthew worked efficiently, his movements economical as he built a fire in the stove. Elizabeth seated herself on one of the chairs, still cradling Grace, her eyes following his movements with cautious attention. "When did you last eat?" Matthew asked, not looking up from his task. Elizabeth hesitated. "Yesterday morning." Without comment, Matthew reached into his saddlebags and pulled out jerky, hardtack, and a small tin of coffee. He set water to boil on the now warming stove, then handed Elizabeth the jerky and hardtack. "Eat slowly," he advised. "Too much too fast will make you sick." As Elizabeth took small, careful bites of the food, Grace began to fuss in her arms. With practiced movements that spoke of months of experience, Elizabeth adjusted her shawl and positioned Grace to nurse, turning slightly away from Matthew for modesty. Matthew busied himself preparing the coffee, his back to her, allowing the small privacy that the confined space could offer. When the coffee was ready, he placed a steaming cup on the table beside her, then seated himself on the other chair, sipping his own coffee in silence. The quiet between them was broken only by the soft sounds of Grace nursing and the crackling of the fire in the stove. Outside, the storm unleashed its fury, wind driving snow against the windows with increasing intensity. After a while, Elizabeth shifted Grace to her shoulder, patting the infant's back gently. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the food and shelter." Matthew nodded once. "Storm like this, you wouldn't have lasted the night." "I know." Her voice was steady, accepting of the harsh truth. Matthew's eyes drifted to the small bundle on Elizabeth's shoulder. "Your daughter. How old?" 6 months. A faint smile touched Elizabeth's lips as she looked down at Grace. "Born on the road." Matthew's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition of what that must have meant for a woman alone. "You're a long way from where you started," he observed. Elizabeth's eyes met his briefly before looking away. "Pennsylvania." Matthew raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he rose and added more wood to the stove, his movements revealing a long scar on his wrist, the unmistakable mark of a bullet graze. Elizabeth noticed it, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "You fought in the war." It wasn't a question, but Matthew answered anyway. "Union, 10th Montana Volunteer Infantry." He flexed his hand unconsciously. Seems a lifetime ago now. The admission opened a narrow doorway between them. Two people who had seen more than their share of hardship, recognizing the weight carried by the other. "My husband was a miner," Elizabeth said after a long moment, her words coming slowly, as if each one cost her. "There was an accident. The shaft collapsed." Matthew nodded, letting the silence give her space to continue or stop as she chose. "The company blamed him. Said he was careless." Her voice grew tight. "The town decided I distracted him. Made him think of home when he should have been thinking of supports and crossbeams." The bitterness in her voice told Matthew this wasn't the first time she had been blamed for a tragedy not of her making. "People need someone to blame," Matthew said quietly, "easier than accepting that sometimes bad things just happen." Elizabeth looked at him, surprise flickering across her features at the unexpected understanding. "Yes," she agreed softly. "That's exactly it." They fell silent again, but the quality of the quiet had changed, less guarded, more companionable. Grace had fallen asleep on Elizabeth's shoulder, her tiny face peaceful in the warm glow from the stove. "You have a place in mind?" Matthew asked eventually. "Somewhere you're headed?" Elizabeth shook her head. Just west, as far from Pennsylvania as I could get. Matthew considered this, his eyes on the fire visible through the grate in the stove door. I have a ranch, Pine Ridge. Runs a timber operation too. It's just me there now, in the main house. Too big for one person. He said this matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather, but his fingers tightened slightly around his coffee cup. There's a room, used to be my wife's sewing room. It's been empty 2 years now. His eyes met Elizabeth briefly before looking away. Could use someone to keep the place in order. Cook, clean. I can pay $20 a month. Elizabeth stared at him, clearly stunned by the offer. $20 was a generous wage, particularly with room and board included. Why would you do that, she asked, wariness returning to her voice. You don't know anything about me. No, you're alone with a child in winter with nowhere to go, Matthew replied evenly. No, you're exhausted but still putting that baby first. No, you've got pride enough not to beg. He took another sip of his coffee, then set the cup down carefully. Out here, we don't much care where people came from. Only matters what they do now. I need help with the house. You need a roof and food for your child. Elizabeth studied him, searching for hidden motives, finding none in his direct gaze. Just until spring, Matthew added. Then you can decide where to go next. Elizabeth looked down at Grace, then back at Matthew. All right, she said finally, until spring. Matthew nodded once, the agreement sealed with a simplicity common to frontier arrangements where a person's words still carried the weight of law. As the storm howled outside, they finished their coffee in silence. Two broken people finding temporary shelter, not just from the blizzard, but from the cold wilderness of their separate griefs. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. They set out at first light, Elizabeth and Grace seated in front of Matthew on his Appaloosa, wrapped in an extra blanket he had found in the cabin. The snow had transformed the landscape into an endless white sea, beautiful and deadly, glittering under the winter sun. Elizabeth gasped softly when Pine Ridge Ranch came into view. The main house was a substantial two-story structure built of squared logs, not rough-hewn like most frontier cabins, but precision-cut ponderosa pine, each log notched with dovetail corners that locked together without need for nails or pegs. A wide porch wrapped around three sides, its roof supported by hand-turned posts of cedar, naturally resistant to rot and insects. Nearby stood a large barn with a gambrel roof designed to maximize hay storage, a practical innovation Matthew had brought from Ohio. The bunkhouse, long and low with a stone foundation, housed the 15 men who worked Matthew's cutting crews. Several outbuildings served specific purposes: smokehouse, tool shed, spring house built over a natural cold spring for storing perishables. Beyond these, nestled against the tree line, stood the operation's heart, the sawmill. Its imposing framework of heavy timbers supported the massive circular saw blade, 52 inches in diameter, triple forged in Pittsburgh, and shipped at considerable expense. The blade could slice through 20-inch diameter logs like butter when driven by the steam engine that now sent plumes of white vapor into the winter sky. The tall brick stack rose like a sentinel, its thin smoke signaling activity despite the weather. It's more than I expected, Elizabeth admitted as they approached, taking in the evidence of careful planning and substantial investment. Matthew guided his horse toward the main house, pride evident in his bearing, though not his words. Lumber's been good business since the railroad started pushing west. Northern Pacific pays top dollar, $17 per thousand board feet, for prime timber, especially the clear grain pine we cut from the north slopes. First-grade lumber without knots or pitch pockets goes for railroad trestles. They won't risk bridges with inferior wood. He nodded toward the mill. That's a Lane and Bodley vertical steam engine, 15 horsepower. Cost me nearly $800 3 years back, but it's paid for itself twice over. Can cut 5,000 board feet in a day with a 5-man crew, compared to maybe 800 feet with a water wheel setup. He helped Elizabeth and Grace down before dismounting himself, his movements efficient despite the cold stiffening his joints. Leading them to the porch, he stomped snow from his boots before opening the front door and ushering them inside. The interior of the house revealed both comfort and neglect. The furnishings were of good quality: solid wood tables, well-made chairs, a large stone fireplace in the main room. But there was dust on the surfaces, ashes piled in the grate, and an air of disuse that spoke of a house that had become merely shelter rather than a home. Elizabeth noticed the small signs of the woman who had once lived there. A shawl hanging on a peg by the door, its blue wool faded and dust-covered, a pair of small shoes tucked beneath a chair, waiting for feet that would never fill them again. A rocking chair positioned before the fireplace, angled as if still expecting its occupant to return. Matthew moved through the space with the careful precision of a man navigating around ghosts, leading Elizabeth to a room off the main living area. It was smaller than the others, with a large window that would catch the morning sun. A sewing table stood against one wall, and a narrow bed against another, its bare mattress speaking of long emptiness. "This was Rebecca's sewing room," Matthew said, his voice betraying no emotion. "You and Grace can use it." Elizabeth stepped into the room, taking in the space that would be theirs. Despite the dust and chill, she could see the possibilities. A safe place for Grace to sleep, a door that could close, windows that looked out on something other than rejection. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll care for it well." Matthew nodded, then showed her the rest of the house. The kitchen with its cast iron stove and pump for water, the pantry with its stores of food, his own room upstairs, which she would not need to tend, and the washroom with its large copper tub. "I'll bring in your things," he said, turning to go. "I don't have anything," Elizabeth admitted. "Just what I'm wearing and Grace's blanket." Matthew paused, considering. "Rebecca's things are still in the wardrobe upstairs. Help yourself to whatever fits. There's baby things, too, in the chest in my room." His voice was gruff, but not unkind. No sense in them sitting unused. With that, he left her to settle in, his boots heavy on the porch as he went to tend to his horse and inform his foreman of the new arrangement. Elizabeth stood in the center of the main room after he had gone, Grace still bundled in her arms, taking in the stillness of the house around her. For the first time in months, there were no accusing eyes watching her, no whispers following in her wake, just quiet and the promise of warmth when she built up the fire. With practiced movements, she placed Grace on a blanket near the fireplace, then set about cleaning away the old ashes and building a new fire. As the flames caught and grew, casting a warm glow through the room, Elizabeth felt something unfamiliar stir within her. Not quite hope, perhaps, but the faint possibility that hope might someday return. Over the next weeks, a cautious routine developed. Elizabeth rose before dawn each day to start the fire and prepare breakfast. Matthew would eat quickly before heading out to the timber operation, returning at midday for a meal, then again in the evening. Their conversations were sparse but not uncomfortable, centered mainly on the practical matters of running the household. Elizabeth threw herself into the work, grateful for the purpose it gave her days. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat rugs on the porch despite the cold. She cooked hearty meals from the well-stocked pantry, learning Matthew's preferences through observation rather than questions. She mended his clothes with neat, tiny stitches that spoke of her careful nature. Grace thrived in the stable environment, gaining weight and beginning to show more interest in the world around her. Elizabeth had fashioned a small bed for her from a wooden crate, lining it with soft blankets from Rebecca's stores. During the day, Grace would lie on a quilt near wherever Elizabeth was working, cooing and waving her tiny fists at dust motes dancing in sunbeams. Matthew kept his distance, careful not to intrude on their space more than necessary. But Elizabeth sometimes caught him watching Grace with an expression that mingled wonder and sorrow in equal measure. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Matthew returned later than usual. Elizabeth had kept his dinner warm on the back of the stove, and Grace was already asleep in her makeshift bed. "There's coffee," Elizabeth said as he stamped snow from his boots at the door. "Fresh made." Matthew nodded his thanks, hanging his coat on the peg beside the blue shawl that Elizabeth had carefully dusted but left in its place. He washed his hands at the kitchen pump, then seated himself at the table where his plate waited. As he ate, Elizabeth noticed he favored his left hand, his right held stiffly. "You're hurt," she observed, pausing in her mending by the fire. Matthew glanced at his right hand, caught it between logs. Nothing broken. Elizabeth set aside her sewing and approached the table. "May I see?" After a moment's hesitation, Matthew extended his hand. Elizabeth took it gently, turning it to examine the damage. The palm was scraped raw, a deep bruise already forming across the knuckles. I can clean and wrap this, she said, so it doesn't fester. Matthew started to protest but stopped when Elizabeth gave him a level look that brooked no argument. With a slight nod, he relinquished his hand to her care. Elizabeth worked methodically, cleaning the wound with warm water and soap, then applying a salve from a small tin she retrieved from her room. As she wrapped his hand in a clean strip of cloth, she noticed other scars marking his skin, old burns, the calluses of a man who had worked with his hands all his life, and on his forearm, the unmistakable puckered mark of a bullet wound. "You've been through wars beyond the one with the Confederacy," she remarked quietly. Matthew's eyes met hers briefly. "As have you." It was an acknowledgement of sorts, a recognition that they were both survivors of private battles that had left their own invisible wounds. As Elizabeth finished tying off the bandage, her fingers lingered briefly on his wrist, where his pulse beat steady and strong beneath her touch. The moment stretched between them, fragile and unexpected. Then Matthew withdrew his hand and cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said simply. Elizabeth nodded, returning to her place by the fire, the quiet that settled between them now charged with something neither was ready to name. The following day brought their first visitor. Dr. Frederick Morgan arrived in a small sleigh, his medical bag in hand, ostensibly checking on families after the recent storms. He was a man of about 50, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles in a manner that put people at ease, despite his educated vocabulary. "Matthew," he greeted warmly as he entered the house. "Thought I'd find you buried in paperwork or out with the cutting crew, not sitting comfortable by your own fire at midday." Matthew rose to shake the doctor's hand. "Frederick, good to see you. We've had some changes here." It was then that Dr. Morgan noticed Elizabeth, who had entered from the kitchen with Grace in her arms. "I see you have indeed," the doctor said, surprise evident in his voice. His eyes moved from Elizabeth to Matthew with open curiosity. "Elizabeth Coulter and her daughter Grace," Matthew introduced. "They're staying through the winter. Elizabeth is helping with the house. Elizabeth, this is Dr. Frederick Morgan, an old friend from the war." Dr. Morgan approached, his smile genuine as he bowed slightly to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Coulter, a pleasure. And this must be little Miss Grace." He peered at the baby with professional interest. "May I?" Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before allowing the doctor to examine Grace. His gentle manner soon put her at ease, and she answered his questions about Grace's feeding and sleep patterns with growing confidence. "She's thriving," Dr. Morgan declared, handing Grace back to Elizabeth. "Whatever you're doing, continue it." He accepted the offer of coffee, settling into a chair at the kitchen table while Elizabeth prepared a fresh pot. As she worked, she could hear the men's conversation drift from the main room. "So you finally took my advice about hiring help," Dr. Morgan was saying. "Found them at Dead Man's Cross during the last storm," Matthew replied. "Couldn't leave them to freeze." "No, you certainly couldn't." There was a pause. "People will talk, Matthew." "People always talk. Doesn't mean I have to listen." Elizabeth stilled at this, her hands hovering over the coffee pot. She should have expected it. The same whispers and judgments that had followed her from Pennsylvania. Of course they would find her here too. "She seems capable," Dr. Morgan continued, "and the child appears well cared for." "They are no concern of the town's," Matthew said firmly. "They're under my roof and my protection." Elizabeth carried the coffee in, her face composed despite the turmoil beneath. As she set the cups on the table, Dr. Morgan looked up at her with kind eyes. "Mrs. Coulter, please don't mistake my concern for judgment. It's only that small towns have long memories and narrow minds. I merely wish to prepare both of you." "I'm familiar with small-town opinions, Dr. Morgan," Elizabeth replied evenly, "but I appreciate your candor." The doctor nodded, then turned to more general topics: the weather, the timber business, news from the larger world that rarely reached Pine Ridge. As he spoke, Elizabeth noticed how he occasionally simplified terms or repeated important points, his gaze assessing Matthew's comprehension. It was during a lull in the conversation that Dr. Morgan mentioned a recent article he had read. It was about that terrible mine collapse in Pennsylvania last year. Awful business, particularly how they blamed that poor young woman whose husband died. Elizabeth froze, her eyes darting to the doctor's face. There was knowledge there, and compassion, but no accusation. "The paper mentioned her by name," Dr. Morgan continued casually. "Elizabeth Coulter, I believe." Said she'd left town afterward. Never understood how people can be so cruel to someone already suffering. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Matthew's eyes moved between the doctor and Elizabeth, piecing together what had been deliberately revealed. Indeed, Matthew said finally, his voice even. Cruelty seems to be a skill some people practice daily. De Morgan smiled slightly, patting Matthew's arm. Well said, my friend. He rose to leave, gathering his coat and bag. Mrs. Calder, it was a pleasure. Perhaps you will bring Grace to town sometime. My wife would be delighted to meet you both. After the doctor had gone, Elizabeth stood by the window, watching his sleigh disappear down the snowy drive. He knows who I am, she said quietly. Yes, Matthew agreed, coming to stand beside her. But Frederick isn't one for gossip. Your secret is safe with him. Elizabeth turned to face Matthew. And with you? Now that you know the rumors about me are true? Matthew held her gaze steadily. Out here, a person's worth isn't measured by what others say about them. It's measured by what they do when the chips are down. He gestured to the house around them, now clean and ordered thanks to her efforts. You've proven your worth to me every day since you arrived. That's all that matters. Elizabeth studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity and finding none. Slowly she nodded, accepting his words and the safety they offered. Now, Matthew said, turning toward the door, I need to check on the new timber delivery, and you should rest while Grace is sleeping. As he pulled on his coat, Matthew paused, his hand on the doorknob. Elizabeth, he said, not turning around, you're not alone anymore. With that, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Elizabeth stood in the suddenly empty room, his words echoing in her mind like a promise. For the first time since the mine collapse had stolen her husband and her reputation, Elizabeth felt the cold grip of isolation loosen ever so slightly around her heart. That evening, Elizabeth discovered an old Bible tucked in a drawer of the sewing table. The leather cover was worn smooth with handling, and when she opened it, the name Rebecca Hayes was inscribed on the flyleaf in delicate, flowing script. Between the pages, pressed flat and preserved, was a small wildflower, its color faded but its form still perfect. Elizabeth carefully closed the Bible and returned it to the drawer, feeling as though she had glimpsed something precious and private. Later, as she nursed Grace before the fire, she noticed Matthew looking at the drawer where the Bible lay hidden, a complex emotion crossing his face before he turned away. The next day, Elizabeth found the Bible placed prominently on the mantel, as if Matthew had made a decision during the night. It was an offering of sorts. A door opened into the life that had existed in this house before her arrival. Elizabeth understood the significance and treated the gesture with the respect it deserved, carefully dusting the Bible's cover, but never presuming to open it again without invitation. As January deepened into February, the patterns of their days grew more comfortable. Elizabeth began to recognize the subtle shifts in Matthew's expression that signaled his moods, learning when to engage him in conversation and when to let him be. Matthew, in turn, started to anticipate Grace's fussy periods, disappearing into the workshop only to return with small carved toys that delighted the growing infant. One evening as snow fell steadily outside, Matthew cleared his throat during dinner, a sign Elizabeth had come to recognize as preceding something he found difficult to say. Been thinking, he began, his eyes on his plate. Grace will need a proper cradle soon. She's outgrowing that crate. Elizabeth nodded, waiting for him to continue. I could make one, he said. Have some good cedar set aside. Thought maybe you might want to help design it. Elizabeth was surprised by the offer. I don't know anything about woodworking. I could teach you, Matthew replied, glancing up briefly, if you're willing to learn. There was something in his voice that went beyond the practical suggestion, a reaching out, an invitation to build something together that wasn't simply about necessity. I'd like that, Elizabeth said softly. Thank you. The following day, Matthew led her to his workshop, a separate building near the main house where he crafted furniture when time allowed. The space was warm from the small stove in the corner, the air rich with the scent of wood shavings and linseed oil. Tools hung in neat rows on the walls, and several projects in various stages of completion sat on workbenches. Matthew showed Elizabeth different types of wood, explaining their properties and uses. He demonstrated how to use a plane, guiding her hands as she made her first shaving, a thin curl of cedar that fell away from the wood like a ribbon. Let the tool do the work, he instructed, his large hands steady over hers. Feel how the grain wants to go. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the solid warmth of him as he guided her movements. It had been so long since she had been touched with kindness, with purpose rather than judgment or necessity. Something shifted within her at the contact, a wall crumbling, a door opening to possibilities she had thought forever lost. For Matthew, the simple act of teaching, of passing on knowledge, awakened something long dormant. He found himself explaining techniques his father had taught him, stories emerging that he had not thought of in years. Elizabeth listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest, laughing at his occasional dry humor. Over the next weeks, they worked on the cradle together in the evenings after dinner. Matthew handled the more complex cuts and joints, but Elizabeth sanded and oiled, learning how to bring out the beauty of the wood grain. She designed a simple pattern of flowers for the headboard, which Matthew carved with painstaking care. As they worked side by side in the warm workshop, with Grace sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby, the barriers between them continued to fall. They shared stories of their earlier lives, Matthew's childhood on a small farm in Ohio, Elizabeth's years teaching in a one-room schoolhouse before her marriage. "I miss it sometimes," Elizabeth admitted one evening as she applied oil to the cradle's rockers. "Teaching, watching a child's face light up when they finally understand something difficult." Matthew nodded, his hands continuing their steady work. "You're good with explanations. Patient." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "You're a good student, determined." Matthew glanced up, catching her eye. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken awareness of how far they had come from that snowy crossroads where they had first met. The cradle took shape slowly, each piece fitted with care. As it neared completion, Elizabeth found herself thinking less and less about leaving when spring came. The thought of Pine Ridge had begun to feel like home in a way no place had since she'd left Pennsylvania. But shadows from the outside world were drawing closer, threatening the fragile peace they had built. On a rare clear day in late February, Matthew returned from a trip to town with tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "William Barrett stopped me today," he said that evening as they sat by the fire. "Offered to buy my land." Again, Elizabeth looked up from her mending. "The banker? Why would he want your land?" "Railroads expanding west. They need timber, and they need right-of-ways." Matthew stared into the fire, his expression grim. "Barrett's been buying up properties all over the county, then selling to Northern Pacific at a profit." "But you already supply timber to the railroad," Elizabeth pointed out. "Wouldn't they want to keep your operation running?" Matthew nodded slowly. "Yes, but Barrett doesn't care about that. He's after the quick profit, and he doesn't like that I won't sell to him." He glanced at Elizabeth. "He mentioned you today." Elizabeth's hands stilled on her sewing. "She asked who the woman and child at my house were. Said people were talking." Matthew's jaw tightened. He implied things. About us. Elizabeth felt a familiar chill settle over her. The whispers had begun again, just as Dr. Morgan had warned. "I've brought trouble to your door," she said quietly. "No." Matthew's voice was firm. "Barrett is the trouble. He's using you as a way to pressure me." He leaned forward, his eyes intent on her face. "Elizabeth, I want you to know that whatever happens, you and Grace have a place here. I won't let Barrett or anyone else drive you away." The conviction in his voice warmed something deep within Elizabeth, a spark of hope kindling into something stronger. For the first time in too long, she felt protected rather than pursued, valued rather than judged. As February gave way to March, the days grew incrementally longer, the sun a little stronger against the snow. The cradle was finished, polished to a warm glow, and Grace slept in it contentedly each night. Elizabeth had begun to think beyond winter to what spring might bring. Not departure, but perhaps a small garden, maybe chickens for fresh eggs. These peaceful contemplations were shattered one morning by the arrival of Reverend Samuel Jenkins, pastor of Timberline's small church. He arrived unannounced, his horse snorting plumes of steam in the cold air. Elizabeth was alone in the house, Matthew having left at dawn with his cutting crew. She watched through the window as the Reverend dismounted and approached the door, his black coat flapping in the wind, his expression solemn. Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth opened the door before he could knock. "Reverend Jenkins," she greeted calmly, Please come in, out of the cold. The Reverend seemed momentarily taken aback by her directness, but quickly recovered. Mrs. Coulter, he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. I hope I find you well. Quite well, thank you, Elizabeth replied, closing the door behind him. May I offer you coffee, water? Coffee would be most welcome. Reverend Jenkins glanced around the main room, his eyes lingering on Grace's cradle, the pair of boots by the door, one large, one small, the evident domesticity of the space. Elizabeth busied herself preparing coffee, aware of the Reverend's assessing gaze. When she returned with 2 cups, she found him examining the Bible on the mantel. Rebecca's, she said, placing his coffee on the table. I dust it daily, but it remains where Matthew prefers it. Reverend Jenkins turned, studying her face. You speak of Mrs. Hayes with familiarity. I live in her house, Elizabeth replied simply. I sleep in her sewing room. I wear dresses she once made. It would be strange not to feel I know her in some small way. The Reverend sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. News travels, Mrs. Coulter, even to remote places like Timberline. News of a mine collapse in Pennsylvania. A widow blamed. A hasty departure. Elizabeth's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. I wondered how long it would take for my past to find me here. Then you don't deny it. What is there to deny? My husband died. People blamed me. I left. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. The only part they got wrong was the blame. Reverend Jenkins set down his cup. And now you live here, unmarried, with Mr. Hayes. Surely you understand how that appears to the community. I understand that people prefer simple stories, Reverend, Elizabeth replied, even when the truth is more complex. I am employed by Mr. Hayes as his housekeeper. I have my own room, as does he. The arrangement is entirely proper. Propriety is not merely about facts, Mrs. Coulter, but about appearances. The Reverend's voice took on a lecturing tone. A young widow living under the roof of a widower, without chaperone or family present. It creates talk that damages both your reputations. Elizabeth felt a familiar anger rising within her. And this concern for our reputations, does it come from genuine care for our souls, Reverend? Or from somewhere else? Reverend Jenkins frowned. I don't take your meaning. I think you do, Elizabeth said quietly. I think you know exactly why rumors are suddenly spreading now, months after my arrival, and I think the name Barrett would feature prominently in the explanation. A flash of discomfort crossed the Reverend's face, quickly masked. Mr. Barrett is a respected member of our community and a generous supporter of the church, but my visit today has nothing to do with him. Doesn't it? Elizabeth moved to the window, looking out at the snowy landscape. It seems convenient that moral concerns arise, just as Mr. Barrett increases his pressure on Matthew to sell this land. Reverend Jenkins rose, his expression hardening. I came here to warn you both, as a Christian duty. Mr. Hayes must either make this arrangement legitimate through marriage, or you must leave. Those are the only options that will satisfy the community's sense of propriety. Elizabeth turned back to face him. And if we do neither? Then I fear the consequences will be severe. The Reverend donned his hat. Good day, Mrs. Coulter. Please convey my message to Mr. Hayes. After he had gone, Elizabeth sank into a chair, her heart pounding. The walls she had so carefully built around her new life were crumbling, just as they had in Pennsylvania. Once again, she was being cast as the corrupting influence, the woman whose very presence threatened the moral fabric of the community. Grace began to cry from her cradle, and Elizabeth went to her, lifting the infant into her arms. Shh, little one, she whispered, fighting back tears of her own. Everything will be all right. But as she looked around the home that had become so dear to her, Elizabeth wondered if anything would ever be all right again. Matthew returned as dusk was falling, snow clinging to his coat and hat, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. He paused in the doorway, immediately sensing the tension in the house. Elizabeth stood by the stove, her back straight, her movements efficient as she prepared the evening meal. Grace lay in her cradle, cooing softly at the carved wooden bird Matthew had made her. What happened? He asked, hanging his coat on the peg. Elizabeth turned, her face composed but her eyes troubled. Reverend Jenkins paid a visit today. Matthew's expression darkened. He crossed to the wash basin, rolling up his sleeves and scrubbing his hands with more force than necessary. And what did the good Reverend have to say? Elizabeth told him of the conversation, relating Jenkins' warnings and ultimatum with careful precision. She watched Matthew's face as she spoke, noting how his jaw tightened, how a muscle pulsed at his temple. "Barrett," Matthew said finally, drying his hands on a towel. "This has his fingerprints all over it." "The Reverend denied it," Elizabeth said, turning back to the stove. "Not convincingly." Matthew gave a short, humorless laugh. "Jenkins wouldn't recognize the truth if it sat next to him in church. Barrett's been buying him for years with donations for a new church roof that never seems to get built." He moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames, his movements controlled but angry. "I've known this was coming. Just didn't expect them to drag you into it." "What will you do?" Elizabeth asked quietly. Matthew straightened, staring into the fire. "Nothing tonight. Tonight we eat, we rest." He turned to face her. "Tomorrow, I'll ride into town and have a word with Barrett myself." Elizabeth nodded, returning to the stove. They ate dinner in relative silence, each lost in thought. Afterward, Matthew surprised her by taking Rebecca's Bible from the mantel and opening it at the kitchen table. He stared at the pages for a long moment before looking up at Elizabeth. "I'm not much for reading," he said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "Rebecca used to read to me every night. Scripture, poetry, newspaper stories. Since she's been gone, I've fallen out of practice." Elizabeth understood what he was asking. Setting Grace in her cradle, she moved to the table and seated herself beside Matthew. Taking the Bible, she began to read in a clear, steady voice, the words filling the kitchen with their ancient rhythms. Matthew closed his eyes, listening. The ritual became their evening comfort over the next several nights. Matthew would work on small carpentry projects at the table, while Elizabeth read aloud, scripture one night, an old book of poetry the next, sometimes stories from the few books stored in a small shelf in the main room. During the day, Matthew spent long hours at the timber operation, returning tired but determined each evening. He had spoken with Barrett, he told Elizabeth, but the conversation had gone poorly. "He thinks he has me cornered," Matthew said as they sat by the fire. "Uses the railroad's demand for timber to claim he's doing me a favor by offering to buy now." "What's his true aim?" Elizabeth asked, her needle flashing in the firelight as she mended one of his shirts. "Land speculation. Railroads planning a spur line that would cut through the eastern edge of my property. If Barrett owns it when they announce the plans, he'll make a fortune." Matthew rubbed a hand over his face. "And he knows I'm vulnerable right now." Elizabeth looked up from her sewing. "Vulnerable how?" Matthew hesitated, then sighed. "Last year's cut was smaller than expected. Heavy snow came early, trapped half our timber on the mountain. Then the spring floods washed out bridges, delayed shipments. I had to take loans to pay the men, meet obligations." "And Barrett holds these loans," Elizabeth guessed. Matthew nodded grimly. "Due in April. He's counting on me not being able to pay, forcing a sale. Can you meet the payment? If this winter's cut makes it to market in time, and if the railroad pays promptly." Matthew's expression was bleak. Two big ifs. Elizabeth hesitated, then set aside her sewing. "Matthew, I found something while organizing your study last week." She rose and went to retrieve a leather-bound book from a drawer, bringing it back to him. "Your accounts from the past 3 years. I didn't mean to pry, but my father taught me bookkeeping when I managed the school funds. There's something you should see." She opened the ledger, her finger tracing along the rows of meticulously penned numbers. "Look here at the timber deliveries from last October. And here, the equipment purchases in July." She turned several pages, and these entries from the previous year. Matthew leaned forward, brow furrowed. The numbers swam before him. He'd always struggled with figures. One reason he'd been grateful for Barrett's bank to handle the accounting. "I don't understand what I'm seeing," he admitted. Elizabeth pointed to specific columns. "Each of these entries has been altered. A transposed number here, a decimal point moved there. Small changes, easy to miss if you're not looking for them." Her teaching voice emerged naturally. "But they compound over time, like water wearing away stone." "Barrett's bank keeps your accounts," she continued, not as a question. "His clerk does the figuring. I just sign the papers," Matthew confirmed, a sinking feeling in his stomach. "These discrepancies all favor the bank," Elizabeth said, her voice firm but gentle. Never you. And they add up to nearly $800 over 3 years. Comprehension dawned in Matthew's eyes, followed quickly by anger. His fist clenched on the table. You're saying Barrett's been stealing from me? All this time? I can't prove intent, Elizabeth cautioned, covering his fist with her hand. But the pattern is undeniable. Matthew's whistle cut through the quiet room. $800. That would cover the April payment with room to spare. If you can prove the discrepancies and force Barrett to acknowledge them, yes. Matthew studied her face, a new respect in his eyes. You've been working this out for days, haven't you? Elizabeth smiled slightly. I may no longer have a classroom, but I still know how to solve a problem. Matthew reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. Thank you, he said simply, his eyes conveying what words could not. Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her at his touch, at the gratitude and admiration in his gaze. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt not just useful, but valued. The moment was interrupted by a soft cry from Grace's cradle. Elizabeth reluctantly withdrew her hand and went to tend to her daughter, aware of Matthew's eyes following her, sensing that something fundamental had shifted between them. One crisp March morning, as the first hints of thaw appeared in sheltered corners of the yard, Matthew invited Elizabeth to join him on his rounds of the property. Grace, bundled against the lingering chill, rode securely in a sling across Elizabeth's chest. Need to check the fence line on the north pasture, Matthew explained. Thought you might like to see more of Pine Ridge than just the house and barn. Elizabeth welcomed the chance to venture beyond her daily routine. They rode double on Matthew's Appaloosa, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, Grace protected between them. The contact was practical, necessary, yet Elizabeth found herself acutely aware of the solid warmth of him, the rhythm of his breathing beneath her hands. They rode in companionable silence, Matthew occasionally pointing out landmarks, the ridge that gave the ranch its name, the creek that would swell with snowmelt in another month, the distant line of mountains still snow-capped against the blue sky. At the north fence, Matthew dismounted first, then helped Elizabeth down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. If Elizabeth noticed, she gave no sign, but color rose in her cheeks that couldn't be blamed entirely on the brisk air. While Matthew inspected the fence, Elizabeth wandered a few steps away, showing Grace the first green shoots pushing through the melting snow. Your first spring, she murmured to her daughter, everything waking up, starting fresh. Matthew approached, a small bouquet of purple crocuses in his gloved hand. Found these in a sheltered spot, he said, offering them to Elizabeth. First flowers of the season. Elizabeth accepted the tiny blooms, touched by the unexpected gesture. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a brief contact that nevertheless sent warmth spreading through her chest. Rebecca used to say crocuses were the bravest flowers, Matthew said, his voice soft with memory. Breaking through the snow when winter's hardly finished. They're beautiful, Elizabeth replied. Then meeting his eyes, she added, thank you for showing me your land. Our land, Matthew corrected quietly, then cleared his throat and turned back to his horse. For as long as you choose to stay, anyway. Elizabeth tucked the flowers carefully into her coat pocket, preserving the moment and the unspoken sentiment behind it. On the ride back to the house, she held Matthew a little more closely than before, and if he noticed, he gave no sign, save for the slight smile that softened his usually solemn face. As February deepened, the days grew marginally longer. The timber operation continued at full capacity, with crews working from dawn until dusk to cut and transport logs while the snow made skidding easier. Matthew spent most days in the field, overseeing the work, returning home with clothing frozen stiff and exhaustion lining his face. Elizabeth kept the house warm and orderly, meals ready when needed, clean clothes laid out each morning. She also continued to examine the accounts, building a case against Barrett with methodical precision. Grace thrived, growing stronger daily. She had begun to sit up on her own, observing the world with curious eyes that increasingly resembled her mother's. Elizabeth often found Matthew watching the child with a softness in his expression that appeared at no other time. One evening, as Matthew worked at the table repairing a broken harness, Grace began to fuss in her cradle. Without thinking, Elizabeth handed the child to him while she went to prepare a bottle. Matthew froze for a moment, then adjusted his large hands to cradle Grace securely. When Elizabeth returned, she found Matthew speaking quietly to Grace, his rough finger gently tracing the curve of her cheek as the baby gazed up at him in fascination. Something clutched in Elizabeth's chest at the sight, a longing so sharp it was almost painful. "She likes your voice," Elizabeth said softly, not wanting to break the spell. Matthew glanced up, a rare smile ghosting across his features. "Reminds me of when I was a boy. My mother would have me hold my little sisters while she cooked. Told me I had the safest hands in Ohio." "You do," Elizabeth agreed, handing him the bottle. "Would you like to feed her?" Matthew hesitated only briefly before nodding. With careful movements, he positioned Grace in the crook of his arm and offered her the bottle. The baby latched on eagerly, tiny hands reaching up to pat at his rough beard. "She's not afraid of you," Elizabeth observed, seating herself nearby. "No," Matthew agreed, wonder in his voice, "though she has more reason than most to fear men." Elizabeth understood his meaning, that Grace, having no father, might naturally be wary of male figures. "Children trust more easily than adults," she said. "They haven't yet learned to expect betrayal." Matthew's eyes met hers over Grace's head. "And you, Elizabeth? Have you learned that lesson too well?" The question hung between them, fraught with deeper meaning. Elizabeth considered her answer carefully. "I've learned caution," she acknowledged, "but I still believe in goodness. I've seen too much of it in this house to believe otherwise." Matthew nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. They sat in companionable silence as Grace finished her bottle, her eyes growing heavy. When she was done, Matthew surprised Elizabeth by standing and gently patting the baby's back as he'd seen Elizabeth do countless times, pacing slowly around the kitchen until Grace released a tiny burp and nestled against his shoulder. "You're a natural," Elizabeth said, smiling at the incongruous sight of the large, weathered man cradling the tiny infant. "Had practice," Matthew replied. "4 younger sisters." A shadow crossed his face. "Lost 2 in the fever year, then Pa in the war. Ma couldn't manage alone, so I joined up to send money home. By the time I returned, she'd sold the farm, moved west with my remaining sisters. Never found them." Elizabeth's heart ached at the matter-of-fact way he related such loss. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Matthew shrugged slightly, careful not to disturb Grace, who had fallen asleep on his shoulder. It was a long time ago. But Elizabeth sensed it wasn't the past for him, that the loss still lived in his present, shaping his solitary ways, his reluctance to form new attachments. "You can put her down now," Elizabeth said gently. "She's sound asleep." Matthew nodded but made no move to relinquish the child. Instead, he lowered himself carefully into a chair, still holding Grace, seemingly content to be her resting place for a while longer. Elizabeth returned to her mending, sneaking glances at the tableau they formed. The hardened timberman and the innocent child, both finding something essential in the other's presence. The weather took a vicious turn the following week. A fierce cold snap descended without warning, temperatures plummeting to dangerous lows. Work at the timber camp halted as men sought shelter, and Matthew remained at Pine Ridge, tending to emergency repairs and ensuring the livestock were protected from the killing cold. Grace developed a cough that rapidly worsened, her tiny body burning with fever by the second day. Elizabeth tried every remedy she knew: cool cloths, willow bark tea administered drop by drop, steam from boiling water infused with pine needles. Nothing helped. By evening, Grace's breathing had become labored, each inhale a terrible wheeze, each exhale a struggle. Elizabeth paced the kitchen, holding the feverish child, fear clutching at her heart. Matthew entered from checking the animals, his face reddening from the extreme cold outside. He took one look at Grace and Elizabeth's expression and immediately understood. "How long has she been this bad?" he asked, removing his gloves. "Since midday," Elizabeth answered, her voice tight with worry. "The fever won't break, and her breathing—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Matthew crossed to them, placing a gentle hand on Grace's forehead. The baby's eyes were half closed, glazed with fever, her lips tinged slightly blue. "She needs a doctor," he said decisively. "In this cold?" Elizabeth looked toward the window where frost had formed thick patterns on the glass. "It's 20 below out there at least. Timberline is hours away." "Then I'll ride fast," Matthew said, already moving toward his coat. Frederick has medicines for lung fever, things we don't have here. Elizabeth felt panic rise within her. Matthew, you could die out there. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. And if I don't go, she might. That's not a choice. Elizabeth knew he was right. Grace's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and without medical intervention, the outcome was terrifyingly clear. Still, the thought of Matthew riding into the deadly cold filled her with dread. Take the strongest horse, she said finally, and every blanket you can carry. Matthew nodded, shrugging into his heaviest coat. He wrapped a wool scarf around his face, pulled on 2 pairs of gloves, and tucked extra socks into his pockets. Elizabeth watched him prepare with the efficiency of a man who understood exactly what he was risking. Before leaving, he crossed to where she stood with Grace. Gently, he placed a gloved hand against the child's cheek. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he cupped Elizabeth's face briefly. Keep her warm. I'll be back before dawn. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that sent a shiver through Elizabeth. She moved to the window, watching as he mounted his most sturdy horse and set off into the swirling darkness, becoming a shadow that was quickly swallowed by the night. The hours that followed were the longest of Elizabeth's life. She kept the fire roaring, heating water for steam, wrapping Grace in warm blankets, singing soft lullabies as she paced the floor. The child's fever continued to rage, her breathing becoming more labored as the night wore on. Elizabeth prayed as she had not prayed since Thomas died, desperate, pleading prayers to a God she was no longer sure listened. She bargained, promised, begged. She spoke to Rebecca too, asking the woman whose house this was to watch over Matthew, to guide him safely through the killing cold. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The timbers of the house creaked and groaned in protest, and despite the fire's heat, frost formed in the corners of the windows. Elizabeth imagined Matthew out in that brutal cold, imagined his hands growing numb, his face burning with frost, his horse struggling through snowdrifts. As the night deepened, Grace grew quieter, her cries weakening to whimpers, then to soft, irregular breaths. Elizabeth's terror grew with each passing hour. She talked constantly to the baby, desperate to keep her engaged with the world. Your father was a good man, she whispered, rocking Grace gently. He would have loved you so much. And Matthew is riding through a blizzard for you right now, because you matter, Grace. You matter so much. The clock on the mantel ticked away the hours. Midnight came and went. Then 1 o'clock. 2. Elizabeth's arms ached from holding Grace, but she dared not put her down. Outside, the wind howled like a creature in pain. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Elizabeth heard it. The sound of hoofbeats, muffled by snow but unmistakable. She rushed to the door, pulling it open to a blast of Arctic air. Matthew half fell from his horse, his movements clumsy with cold. His face was red and swollen with frostbite. Ice clung to his beard and eyebrows, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, were frighteningly white at the fingertips. But in his coat pocket, wrapped in layers of cloth, was a small brown bottle. 2 drops every 4 hours, he managed through chattering teeth. In water. Frederick says, keep her warm. Steam if possible. Elizabeth's relief at seeing him alive warred with her concern for his condition. She quickly administered the medicine to Grace, then turned her attention to Matthew. His coat was frozen solid in places, and when she helped him remove his boots, his socks were stiff with ice. She guided him to a chair by the fire, wrapped him in warmed blankets, and prepared hot coffee laced with whiskey. As she worked, she noticed his hands, red and swollen where they weren't alarmingly white, the skin tight and shiny. Your hands, she said, taking them gently in hers. Frostbite. Matthew nodded, wincing as feeling began to return. Worth it, he said simply, his eyes moving to Grace, who already seemed to be breathing a little easier. Elizabeth filled a basin with lukewarm water, not hot, as she knew that could damage frostbitten flesh further. Carefully, she submerged his hands, holding them beneath the surface despite his hiss of pain. I know it hurts, she soothed, but we need to warm them slowly. As she tended to him, Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. This man had risked his life, without hesitation, riding into deadly cold to save a child who was not his own. Such selflessness was beyond anything she had experienced since Thomas died. Why would you risk this? She asked softly, her eyes meeting his across the basin. For us, Matthew replied, his voice rough with cold and emotion. His gaze held hers steadily. Because you're not lost anymore, Elizabeth. And truth is, neither am I. Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes. She brought his hands to her face, pressing them gently against her wet cheeks. Your hands will heal, she whispered. A faint smile touched his frost-chapped lips. Just like the rest of me has been healing since you walked into that crossroads. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then Grace coughed from her cradle, a looser sound now, less desperate, and the spell was broken. Elizabeth reluctantly released Matthew's hands and went to check on her daughter. Her fever's down, she reported, relief evident in her voice. And her breathing is easier. Matthew nodded, exhaustion finally catching up with him as the crisis passed. Frederick said, the medicine works quickly. Should see improvement by morning. You should rest now, Elizabeth told him, helping him to his feet. You've done enough for one night. Matthew didn't argue, allowing her to guide him to the sofa near the fire. He was asleep almost before his head touched the cushion, his body surrendering to exhaustion now that its mission was accomplished. Elizabeth covered him with a warm quilt, then settled into a chair nearby, Grace cradled in her arms. As she watched Matthew sleep, his face relaxed in repose, she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with this quiet, honorable man who spoke little but whose actions revealed a heart of extraordinary generosity. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. Grace's recovery was slow but steady. By morning, her fever had broken completely, and though her cough persisted, it was no longer the desperate struggle for air that had so terrified Elizabeth. Matthew's hands, while painful and blistered in places, would heal without permanent damage, a minor miracle given the severity of the cold. For the next week, the usual dynamics of the household shifted. Elizabeth cared for both Grace and Matthew, preparing special foods to help Grace regain her strength and carefully tending to Matthew's injured hands. Matthew, unable to work with the timber crews, spent his days catching up on correspondence and accounts at the kitchen table, occasionally reading aloud from the newspaper to practice his improving skills. It was during this period of forced intimacy that Elizabeth discovered the scars on Matthew's back. She had been helping him change the bandages on his hands when he winced, his shoulder clearly paining him from sleeping awkwardly on the sofa. Let me see, Elizabeth insisted, moving behind him. Matthew hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned his shirt and slipped it from his shoulders. Elizabeth gasped softly at what was revealed, a network of old scars crisscrossing his back, some thin and white with age, others broader, more ragged. Gettysburg, Matthew said quietly, answering her unasked question. Cannon fire sent a tree down on our position, splinters like daggers. 20 men in my unit, 6 walked away. Elizabeth gently touched one of the larger scars, feeling the ridged tissue beneath her fingertips. You carry your war with you, she observed softly. We all do, Matthew replied. Some scars just show more than others. Elizabeth understood he was speaking of her own invisible wounds, the grief, the shame, the isolation she had carried from Pennsylvania. Impulsively, she bent and pressed her lips to one of the scars, a gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance that made Matthew go very still. Elizabeth, he began, his voice hoarse, but she stepped away, suddenly aware of the intimacy of her action. I should check on Grace, she said, leaving him sitting shirtless by the fire, his expression unreadable. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the air between them was charged with awareness. Elizabeth found herself noticing details she had always registered but never fully acknowledged. The strong line of Matthew's jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the gentleness of his large hands despite their power. Matthew, too, seemed newly attentive to her presence, his eyes following her movements as she cleared away their dinner dishes, his expression softening whenever she laughed at Grace's antics. They were creating a tentative new language between them, a language of glance, of fingertips brushing when passing a cup, of shared smiles over Grace's head. It was fragile and beautiful, this unspoken understanding, and Elizabeth found herself fiercely protective of it. The spell was broken 3 days later with the arrival of Reverend Jenkins, accompanied this time by Sheriff Wilson and William Barrett. Elizabeth saw them approaching from the kitchen window, three riders cutting dark shapes against the snow-covered landscape. "Matthew," she called, her voice tight with apprehension. He joined her at the window, his expression hardening as he recognized the visitors. "Take Grace to your room," he said quietly. "No need for her to witness this." Elizabeth nodded, gathering Grace from her play area on the kitchen floor. As she moved toward her room, Matthew caught her arm gently. "Whatever happens," he said, his eyes intense, "remember that you have a home here. That won't change." Elizabeth wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her that men's promises often crumbled under public pressure. Still she nodded, carrying Grace to her room and closing the door, though she remained near it, listening. She heard the front door open, heard the murmur of male voices, Matthew's deep and controlled, Barrett's smooth and condescending, Jenkins' righteous tones, and Wilson's uncomfortable rumble. The conversation moved to the main room, voices growing clearer. "The situation has become untenable," Hayes, Barrett was saying. "The community is in an uproar. A respectable businessman like yourself, harboring a woman of questionable reputation, it reflects poorly on all of us." "Mrs. Coulter is employed as my housekeeper," Matthew replied evenly. "Her reputation is not questionable. It was deliberately destroyed by men who needed a scapegoat. Much like your attempt in Dow, Barrett." "Be that as it may," Jenkins interjected, "appearances matter. The moral fabric of our community." "Save the sermon," Matthew cut him off. "We both know this isn't about morality. It's about that railroad spur line and Barrett's land speculation." There was a moment of startled silence, then Barrett's laugh, too smooth to be genuine. "You always did have an active imagination, Hayes. This visit is about decency, nothing more." "Is that why you've been falsifying my accounts for 3 years?" Matthew asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "For decency's sake?" Elizabeth heard a sharp intake of breath, then Barrett's voice, tighter now. "That's a serious accusation, Hayes, one you can't prove." "Can I?" The sound of papers rustling. "These are copies of my ledgers, and these are the bank's records. Notice the discrepancies? Always in your favor. Never mine. Almost $800 over 3 years. Clerical errors," Barrett dismissed. "Nothing more." "Remarkably consistent errors," Matthew observed. "Sheriff Wilson might be interested in examining them more closely." Elizabeth could imagine Wilson's discomfort, caught between his duty and Barrett's influence. "Perhaps this isn't the time," the sheriff began. "No, it's exactly the time," Matthew interrupted. "Barrett came here thinking to pressure me through Mrs. Coulter's reputation. Instead, he's going to leave understanding that I know exactly what he's been doing and that I won't stand for it any longer." Elizabeth felt a surge of pride at Matthew's defense, at his refusal to be intimidated. She pressed closer to the door, straining to hear Barrett's response. "You're making a grave mistake, Hayes," Barrett said, his voice cold now, all pretense of civility gone. "This woman has clouded your judgment. She'll bring you nothing but ruin, just as she did her husband." "Mrs. Coulter has brought nothing but order and grace to this house," Matthew replied steadily. "The only ruin I see coming is the one you are creating for yourself, Barrett." "Reverend Jenkins," Barrett appealed, "surely you can make him see reason." "I believe Mr. Hayes has made his position quite clear," Jenkins said, his voice uncertain. "Perhaps we should—" "If you side with him, you can forget that new church roof," Barrett snapped, his composure finally cracking. There was a heavy silence, then Jenkins' sigh. "Miss Barrett, I think we should leave." "Not without resolving this situation," Barrett insisted. "Hayes, you have two choices. Marry the woman properly or send her away. Those are the only acceptable solutions." Elizabeth held her breath, waiting for Matthew's response. The silence stretched, became unbearable. Then Wilson spoke up. "Barrett, we've said our piece. It's time to go." More silence, then the sound of boots on the wooden floor, the front door opening and closing. Through a gap in the curtains, Elizabeth watched the three men mount their horses and ride away, Barrett's rigid back a testament to his fury. She waited, expecting Matthew to come to her room, to tell her what had happened, to reassure her. When several minutes passed without his appearance, Elizabeth opened the door, Grace on her hip, and stepped into the main room. Matthew stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his expression troubled. He glanced up as she entered, then quickly away, as if unable to meet her eyes. "You heard?" he asked, his voice rough. "Most of it," Elizabeth admitted. You stood up to bear it admirably. Matthew nodded absently, still not looking at her. He won't give up. This was just the first attempt. Elizabeth moved closer, trying to understand his distress. But you exposed his fraud. Surely that gives you leverage. For now, Matthew finally turned to face her, his expression pained. Elizabeth, what Barrett said about you bringing ruin, it's not true. You know that, don't you? Of course, she said, though the old doubt stirred within her. Matthew, what's wrong? What aren't you telling me? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. When Barrett demanded I marry you or send you away, I couldn't speak. I froze. Elizabeth felt a chill pass through her. You were considering which option to choose. No. Matthew moved toward her, stopping just short of touching her. God, no. I was remembering after Rebecca died. The whispers, the judgment, how the town turned its back when I needed support most. Elizabeth understood then. He had been paralyzed not by indecision, but by the memory of past rejection, the fear of history repeating itself. It's all right, she said softly. I understand fear. Matthew shook his head, self-recrimination in his eyes. It's not all right. I should have told Barrett exactly what I thought of his ultimatum. Instead, I said nothing, and now he thinks he's won. Elizabeth shifted Grace to her other hip, considering her next words carefully. What would you have said if fear hadn't stopped you? Matthew looked directly at her then, his gaze unwavering. I would have said that my relationship with you is not for public approval or discussion. That you and Grace have brought life back to this house, and to me. He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself on the edge of a revelation he wasn't ready to make. Elizabeth waited, her heart beating faster, but Matthew turned away again, his shoulders tense. I need to check on the stock, he said. The temperature's dropping again. He grabbed his coat and was gone before Elizabeth could respond, leaving her standing in the middle of the room with Grace, the unfinished conversation hanging in the air between them. As she prepared dinner that evening, Elizabeth considered her options. Matthew's reaction to Barrett's ultimatum had shaken her confidence in her position at Pine Ridge. Despite his assurances, she had seen how public pressure could change a man's mind, had experienced firsthand how quickly protection could turn to abandonment when community opinions shifted. Perhaps it would be better to leave on her own terms, before Barrett's campaign against her gained momentum. She had saved most of her wages. With spring approaching, travel would soon be possible again. She could find another position, perhaps in a larger town where her past wouldn't matter as much. The thought of leaving Pine Ridge, leaving Matthew, sent a sharp pain through her chest. But hadn't she learned that pain was the inevitable companion of attachment? Wasn't it better to control the terms of separation than to wait for rejection? By the time Matthew returned from his chores, Elizabeth had made her decision. She served dinner as usual, listened as he discussed the timber operation's progress, responded appropriately to his questions about Grace's health. But inside, she was already preparing for departure, mentally cataloging what she would take, what route she would follow. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Elizabeth finally spoke. I think it would be best if Grace and I left Pine Ridge. Matthew's head snapped up, shock evident in his expression. What? Wait, you know why, Elizabeth replied calmly, though her heart was racing. Barrett won't stop. The pressure will only increase. Your business, your reputation in the community, they'll all suffer if we stay. I don't give a damn about any of that, Matthew said, leaning forward intently. Now perhaps, Elizabeth acknowledged, but over time, when the bank calls in your loans early, when suppliers refuse to work with you, when your men start leaving because their families face the same ostracism. Matthew stood abruptly, pacing before the fire. So you just leave? After everything? Elizabeth felt tears threatening but held them back. I'm trying to protect what you've built here, what your hard work has created. By tearing down what we've built together, Matthew demanded, gesturing to the home around them, the home they had created from the empty shell it had been when she arrived. We haven't built anything permanent, Elizabeth said, the words painful to speak. I'm your housekeeper, Matthew. Our arrangement was always temporary. Matthew stopped pacing, turning to face her with an expression of disbelief. Is that all you think this is, an arrangement? Elizabeth stood as well, unable to remain seated under the intensity of his gaze. What else could it be? You've never suggested otherwise. Haven't I? Matthew took a step toward her. Maybe not in words. I'm not good with those. But in every other way, he gestured to Grace's cradle, to the kitchen table where they shared meals, to the books they read together in the evenings. What do you think all this means? Elizabeth felt her resolve wavering, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. It means we found comfort in each other's company during a difficult winter. It doesn't mean you're prepared to face the consequences of defying Barrett and the town. You think I'm a coward, Matthew said, his voice low, because I hesitated today. No, Elizabeth replied softly. I think you're a man who's already lost too much. I won't be the cause of you losing more. Matthew crossed to her then, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flecks of amber in his gray eyes. Elizabeth, he said, her name a caress in his voice. The only loss I couldn't bear now would be you and Grace leaving. Elizabeth wanted desperately to believe him, to trust in what was growing between them. But experience had taught her that men's convictions often faltered in the face of public opinion. Even Thomas, who had loved her, had been susceptible to the mine manager's influence, had begun to distance himself in those final weeks before the accident. I think it would be best, she said again, each word an effort, if we made a clean break, before Grace and I become more attached, before the situation grows more complicated. Matthew stared at her for a long moment, hurt and disbelief warring in his expression. Then something in him seemed to close off, his face settling into the remote mask she had seen when they first met. If that's what you want, he said finally, his voice devoid of emotion, I won't force you to stay. He turned and walked to the door, grabbing his coat. I need to check the barn again, he said, not looking back. The temperature's still dropping. After he had gone, Elizabeth sank into a chair, the tears she had been holding back finally breaking free. Grace, sensing her mother's distress, began to fuss in her cradle. Elizabeth gathered her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. We'll be all right, she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as Grace. We've been alone before, we can do it again. But as she rocked her daughter in the home that had sheltered them through the winter, Elizabeth wondered if surviving alone was truly enough anymore. If, having known the warmth of belonging, she could ever be satisfied with mere existence again. The night grew deeper, colder. Elizabeth packed methodically, her movements slow and deliberate as she folded the few dresses she had come to think of as her own. In truth, they had been Rebecca's, altered to fit her smaller frame. Would she take them or leave them behind, a final acknowledgement that she had only been borrowing another woman's life? She laid a hand on a blue woolen dress that Matthew had once commented brought out her eyes. The fabric was soft from years of wear, the stitching neat and precise. Rebecca's handiwork. Elizabeth decided she would leave this one behind. It belonged here with the memories of the woman who had made it. Grace slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of the upheaval to come. Elizabeth envied her daughter's innocent slumber. Her own thoughts churned relentlessly, replaying the conversation with Matthew, searching for words she might have said differently, actions she might have taken. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows with renewed fury. Elizabeth could hear the timbers of the house creaking in protest against the cold. In the barn, Matthew was likely checking on the horses one last time, his breath clouding in the frigid air, his movements efficient despite the sorrow he had seen in his eyes. She had heard him. That knowledge sat like a stone in her chest. She had looked into the face of a man who had ridden through a killing blizzard to save her daughter and told him she was leaving. Because she was afraid. Because experience had taught her that happiness was fleeting, that security could be snatched away in an instant. The door opened, then closed with a soft thud. Matthew's boots crossed the main room, paused, then continued up the stairs to his bedroom. No light appeared beneath Elizabeth's door, no knock came, just silence. Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed, a chemise half folded in her hands, and allowed herself to imagine just for a moment what might have been. A life here at Pine Ridge, Matthew teaching Grace to ride a pony, to identify the different trees in the forest. Perhaps other children someday, with Matthew's gray eyes and quiet determination. A family built not from obligation but from choice, from the slow accumulation of shared days and quiet understandings. A fantasy, nothing more. The reality was Barrett and his influence, the town's judgment, the precarious nature of Matthew's business. The reality was that Elizabeth Coulter brought misfortune to those associated with her. Or so the world had convinced her. She resumed packing, pushing away the vision of what could never be. By dawn, she would be ready. One of the hands could drive them to Timberline, where the stage passed through weekly. From there, west perhaps, Oregon, California. Somewhere she could start fresh, where no one knew her name or history. Elizabeth finished her packing and lay down beside Grace's cradle, though she knew sleep would not come. The house settled around her, the familiar creaks and sighs of the old timber, a lullaby she had grown accustomed to over the winter months. Soon these sounds would be only memory. In his room above, Matthew sat at the small desk beneath the window, staring at an object in his hands. It was a pressed wildflower, pale blue, its delicate petals preserved between the pages of Rebecca's Bible. She had picked it the day she told him she was pregnant, her face glowing with joy. Now he studied it in the lamplight, turning it carefully as if it might offer guidance. He had failed again, failed to speak when it mattered most. First with Barrett in his ultimatum, then with Elizabeth. The words he needed had caught in his throat, trapped behind years of solitude and grief. Matthew opened the Bible to the book of Ruth, finding the passage Rebecca had read to him many times during their marriage. His finger traced the familiar words, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people." Words of commitment, of choosing another's path as one's own. Words he should have spoken to Elizabeth. Matthew closed the Bible, decision crystallizing within him. He would not fail a third time. When morning came, he would speak plainly, offer what was truly in his heart. If she still chose to leave, he would accept her decision. But he would not let her go without knowing exactly what she was leaving behind. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Elizabeth rose early, dressing quietly so as not to wake Grace. She moved through her morning routine automatically, building up the fire, preparing coffee, mixing biscuit dough. One last breakfast in this kitchen. One last meal to prepare for Matthew before their paths diverged. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, steeled herself for the encounter. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, Elizabeth was struck by his appearance. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his face drawn, eyes shadowed. But there was a determination in his bearing that hadn't been there the night before. "Good morning," she said, turning back to the stove to hide the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Elizabeth," Matthew began, his voice rough with fatigue. "I need to—" A loud knock at the front door interrupted him. They both turned toward the sound, startled. Visitors were rare at Pine Ridge, especially at this early hour. Matthew moved to answer it, tension evident in his shoulders. Elizabeth followed, Grace now awake and balanced on her hip. Sheriff Wilson stood on the porch, his expression grim beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, a group of men on horseback waited in the yard, Barrett among them, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. Reverend Jenkins sat uncomfortably on his horse to one side, not meeting Matthew's eyes. "Hayes," Wilson said, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb you so early." "What's the meaning of this, Wilson?" Matthew demanded, standing squarely in the doorway. "Community delegation," Wilson replied, clearly uncomfortable with his role. "There's been talk, concerns about the situation here." His eyes flicked briefly to Elizabeth and Grace. Barrett urged his horse forward. "We've come to resolve this matter once and for all, Hayes. The moral reputation of Timberline is at stake." Matthew's jaw tightened. "My private life is none of your concern, Barrett." "When it affects the community, it becomes our concern," Barrett countered. "A respectable businessman like yourself, living in sin with a woman of questionable virtue. Choose your next words carefully," Matthew warned, his voice dangerously quiet. Barrett smiled thinly. "The solution is simple. Make an honest woman of Mrs. Coulter, or send her on her way. Those are your only options if you wish to remain in good standing in this community." Elizabeth felt herself go cold at Barrett's words, at the casual cruelty with which he dismissed her humanity, reducing her to a problem requiring solution. She stepped forward, intending to speak, but Matthew's voice rang out first. "You speak of morality, Barrett, while falsifying accounts and manipulating people for your own gain." Matthew's voice carried across the yard, causing several of the riders to exchange uncomfortable glances. You use the church and the sheriff's office as tools for your land speculation, and you dare to judge me? Barrett's face darkened with anger. This isn't about business, Hayes. It's about decency, about protecting our town from corrupting influences. No, Matthew countered. It's about you wanting my land for that railroad spur line. It's about you using any leverage you can find, including Mrs. Coulter's presence here, to force me to sell. A murmur ran through the assembled men. Several looked at Barrett with newfound suspicion. That's absurd, Barrett blustered. Sheriff, we came here for a purpose. Either Hayes agrees to our terms, or there will be consequences. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. What kind of consequences are you suggesting, Barrett? Because I won't be part of anything that breaks the law. Social consequences, Barrett clarified. Economic ones. No one in Timberline will do business with Hayes. No one will sell to him or buy from him. His timber operation will be boycotted. He'll be a pariah. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Matthew remained silent for a long moment, his face unreadable. Elizabeth's heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared. Matthew forced to choose between his livelihood and her presence in his home. She knew what his choice would be, what it had to be. She stepped forward, Grace clutched protectively against her. That won't be necessary, she said, her voice steady despite the pain tearing at her. Grace and I will be leaving today. Our bags are packed. A satisfied smile spread across Barrett's face. Behind him, Jenkins nodded approvingly. Even Wilson looked relieved at this apparent resolution. Matthew turned to Elizabeth, shock and betrayal written plainly on his features. Elizabeth, no. It's for the best, she cut him off, unable to meet his eyes. I've made my decision. She turned and walked back into the house, heading for her room where her packed bags waited. Behind her, she heard Matthew speaking to the men, his voice too low to distinguish words. The front door closed moments later. Elizabeth moved quickly now, gathering her things, tears blurring her vision. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it. Yet the reality was far more painful than she had anticipated. The home she had come to love, the man she had begun to trust, and all to be left behind. Again. She was folding Grace's blanket when Matthew appeared in the doorway of her room. His expression stopped her. Not the defeat she had expected, but a quiet, implacable resolve. You're not going anywhere, he said simply. Elizabeth stared at him. Matthew, you heard Barrett. The consequences. I don't care about Barrett or his threats. Matthew stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. I care about you and Grace. I care about the life we've begun to build here. A life that will be destroyed if we stay, Elizabeth argued, though her resolve was weakening under his steady gaze. No, Matthew said firmly, a life that will be destroyed if you leave. He took her hands in his grip warm and sure. Elizabeth, when Rebecca died, this house became just walls and a roof. Then you arrived, and somehow it became a home again. You brought light back into rooms that had been dark for too long. You brought purpose back to days that had been merely endured. Elizabeth felt tears forming, tried to blink them away. Matthew, please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm making it honest, he replied. Something I should have done yesterday when Barrett issued his ultimatum. Something I should have done every day since I realized what you mean to me. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing the pressed wildflower she had seen once before in Rebecca's Bible. Rebecca picked this the day she told me about our child. She said it represented new beginnings, hope after sorrow. He offered it to Elizabeth. I want that again, with you. Elizabeth stared at the delicate bloom, understanding the significance of his gesture. Barrett won't stop, she whispered. The town won't accept us. Then we'll build our own community, Matthew said with quiet certainty. My workers and their families. Dr. Morgan and his wife. People who judge by character, not gossip. He cupped her face gently in his calloused hand. I'm not asking you to stay as my housekeeper, Elizabeth. I'm asking you to stay as my wife. To build a life with me at Pine Ridge. A real life, not just an arrangement until spring. Elizabeth felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of his words, his touch. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice barely audible. So am I, Matthew confessed, afraid of losing you, afraid of returning to the half-life I lived before you came. but I'm more afraid of never taking this chance. He stepped back slightly, giving her space to think, to decide. Barrett and his men are still outside, waiting for your answer. For our answer. What shall I tell them? Elizabeth looked down at Grace in her arms, then at the small room that had sheltered them through the winter. She thought of the meals shared at Matthew's table, the evenings reading by the fire, the gradual healing that had begun for both of them amid the snow and silence of Pine Ridge. Leaving would be safer, perhaps, but safety wasn't living. It was merely surviving. She raised her eyes to Matthew's face, seeing there the promise of something she had thought forever lost to her, a future built on mutual respect and growing love. Tell them, she said, her voice strengthening with each word, that Elizabeth Coulter isn't going anywhere. Tell them that Pine Ridge is my home now. Our home. Relief and joy transformed Matthew's face. He stepped forward, gathering her and Grace into a careful embrace. For a long moment they stood together, three hearts beating as one in the quiet room. Then Matthew pulled back, his eyes bright with purpose. Wait here, he said. There's something I need to do first. He strode from the room, his footsteps echoing through the house. Elizabeth followed more slowly, Grace still in her arms. From the window, she watched as Matthew emerged onto the porch, facing Barrett and his delegation with squared shoulders and unwavering resolve. Though she couldn't hear his words, Elizabeth saw their effect. Barrett's face flushed with anger. Jenkins looked away, embarrassed. Several of the riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, clearly regretting their participation in this morning's errand. Then, to Elizabeth's surprise, Matthew descended the porch steps and walked to where his horse was tethered. He swung into the saddle in one fluid motion. Elizabeth, he called toward the house, get your coat. We're going to town. Bewildered but trusting, Elizabeth quickly bundled Grace in warm blankets and put on her heaviest coat. By the time she emerged onto the porch, Matthew had ridden to the steps, extending his hand down to her. What are you doing? She asked as he helped her up behind him, Grace secure between them. Something I should have done the day Barrett first threatened us, Matthew replied. We're going to face this head on. The delegation of men watched in confusion as Matthew turned his horse toward Timberline, Elizabeth and Grace behind him. Barrett sputtered in outrage, but Matthew paid him no mind, setting off at a steady pace toward town. The riders had no choice but to follow, creating an odd procession through the snow-covered landscape. Elizabeth held tight to Matthew's waist, her faith in him growing with each mile. Whatever he planned, she would stand beside him. Timberline appeared on the horizon, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear winter sky. It was market day, Elizabeth realized, seeing the wagons gathered in the town square. The timing was deliberate on Matthew's part, ensuring the maximum number of witnesses. They rode directly to the square, drawing curious stares from the townsfolk going about their business. Matthew dismounted first, then helped Elizabeth down, keeping her hand firmly in his as they faced the gathering crowd. Barrett and his men arrived moments later, dismounting in a clatter of boots and jingling spurs. Friends and neighbors, Matthew called out, his voice carrying across the square, with the resonance that had once commanded men in battle. I've come to address rumors that have been circulating about my household at Pine Ridge. Conversations ceased as townspeople turned toward the unexpected spectacle. Merchants abandoned their stalls, mothers hushed curious children, and men removed hats as they sensed the gravity of the moment. Elizabeth stood tall beside Matthew, her spine straight as a lodgepole pine. Grace bundled protectively in her arms. She met the curious and sometimes judgmental gazes without flinching. A woman who had weathered too many storms to bow before mere disapproval. This morning, Matthew continued, his tone measured but carrying an undercurrent of steel, William Barrett and these men came to my home with an ultimatum. Marry Mrs. Coulter or send her away. They claimed to represent the moral conscience of Timberline. The words hung in the cold air as murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Some faces registered surprise, others knowing nods. The dynamics of small towns, leaving few secrets truly hidden. Barrett stepped forward, the confident stride of a man accustomed to controlling conversations. His expensive coat and polished boots stood in stark contrast to Matthew's practical frontier attire. Hayes, this public spectacle is unnecessary and unseemly, he pronounced with practiced authority. We were merely expressing legitimate community concern about impropriety. No. Matthew's interruption came not as a shout, but as a statement of absolute fact, cutting through Barrett's smooth rhetoric like an axe through pine. This was never about morality or community standards. He turned to address the gathered townspeople directly, his gaze moving deliberately from face to face. Some of you have known me since I arrived here, with nothing but my wife Rebecca and the tools on my back. You know I'm not a man who speaks publicly unless there is cause. His voice lowered, compelling people to lean in. What you're witnessing today is an attempt to manipulate not just me, but this entire community. Barrett has been using rumors and moral posturing to pressure me into selling land he knows will increase tenfold in value once the railroad announces its new spur line. Information he's kept from all of you while buying up properties throughout the county. Matthew's eyes locked on Barrett's. You were using Mrs. Calder's presence in my home as leverage, banking on prejudice and gossip to achieve what honest business couldn't. The crowd's attention shifted to Barrett, who flushed darkly. That's preposterous, he blustered. This is about moral standards, nothing more. Matthew reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. This is a copy of the proposed Northern Pacific Spur Line, he said, holding it up for all to see. A plan not yet made public, but which would increase the value of my eastern acreage tenfold once announced. Land that Barrett has been pressuring me to sell for months. Shock registered on many faces. Barrett's scheme, laid bare in the town square, was quickly losing its veneer of moral authority. Furthermore, Matthew continued relentlessly, Barrett has been falsifying my bank accounts for years, skimming small amounts that accumulated to nearly $800. Money that would have covered the loans he's now threatening to call in. Sheriff Wilson stepped forward, his expression grave. Those are serious allegations, Hayes. Can you prove them? The ledgers are at my house, Matthew replied. Every discrepancy documented. Dr. Morgan has reviewed them as a neutral party and will attest to their accuracy. Barrett's face had gone from red to white. This is slander, he hissed. I'll ruin you for this, Hayes. No, came a voice from the crowd. You won't. Martha Coleman pushed her way forward, her gray hair visible beneath a woolen shawl. At 65, she was Timberline's most respected widow, her late husband having been the town's founder. William Barrett, she said, her voice clear and carrying, you've bullied this town for too long, using the church's need for a new roof to manipulate Reverend Jenkins, using your position at the bank to pressure business owners, using gossip to destroy reputations when it suited your purposes. She turned to face the crowd. I was there when Hayes brought Mrs. Calder and her child to town for the first time. I saw nothing improper in their behavior. I saw a man providing shelter to a woman and infant who would have died in the storm otherwise. I saw Christian charity, not sin. A murmur of agreement rose from several women in the crowd. Martha moved to stand beside Elizabeth, placing a supportive hand on her arm. This young woman has suffered enough, Martha continued. Lost her husband, been driven from her home by cruel gossip, traveled across the country with a baby. And when she finally found safety, Barrett tried to use her very presence as a weapon against her protector. She looked directly at Reverend Morgan. Is that the Christian way, Reverend? To persecute the vulnerable? To use morality as a club? Jenkins had the grace to look ashamed, removing his hat and holding it before him. No, Mrs. Coleman, it is not. Matthew stepped forward again, his presence commanding attention. I didn't bring Elizabeth here to defend her honor. It needs no defense. I brought her to make a public declaration. He turned to face Elizabeth, taking both her hands in his. Grace, secure in her blankets, watched with wide eyes from Elizabeth's arms. Elizabeth Coulter, Matthew said, his voice strong and sure. I love you. I have from the moment you stood at that crossroads and admitted you were lost. Because I was lost too, until you found me. Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes as the words she had longed to hear finally came. Not whispered in private, but declared before the entire town. I'm asking you here before witnesses, Matthew continued, to be my wife. Not because Barrett demands it or because the town expects it, but because I cannot imagine my life without you and Grace in it. The square had gone completely silent. Every face turned toward them, witnessing this most intimate of moments played out in public. Elizabeth felt the weight of their attention, but found she no longer cared what they thought. Only Matthew mattered now. Yes, she said simply, her voice clear in the winter air. I will be your wife, Matthew Hayes. Not because anyone demands it, but because I love you too. A spontaneous cheer erupted from several onlookers, breaking the tension. Martha Coleman wiped tears from her eyes, nodding in approval. Even Sheriff Wilson managed a smile, tipping his hat to the couple. Barrett, seeing his power over the situation evaporating, made one last attempt. This changes nothing, Hayes, he spat. Your loans are still due in April. You still need the town's business to survive. Actually, daughter, Morgan spoke up, stepping forward from where he had been observing. I believe those loans will be settled immediately. He reached into his coat and produced a bank draft. This represents the funds you've embezzled from Mr. Hayes over the years, plus interest. My wife and I are countersigning as witnesses to the transaction. He handed the draft to Sheriff Wilson. I suggest you accept this as payment in full, Barrett, and consider yourself fortunate that Hayes isn't pressing charges for fraud. Barrett looked from the draft to the increasingly hostile crowd, understanding that his position in the community had been irreparably damaged. Without another word, he snatched the paper from Wilson's hand and stalked away toward the bank, defeat evident in every line of his body. Reverend Jenkins approached Matthew and Elizabeth, contrition in his expression. Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Coulter, I owe you both an apology. I allowed myself to be influenced by Barrett, to see sin where there was only kindness and charity. Apology accepted, Reverend, Matthew said, his tone civil if not warm. And since you're here, perhaps you could perform a service for us. Jenkins looked confused. Service? A wedding, Matthew explained, not because you or anyone else insists upon it, but because Elizabeth and I wish to be married. Today. Jenkins blinked in surprise. Today? But there are preparations, arrangements. All we need, Elizabeth interjected gently, is each other and someone to say the words. The rest is just decoration. The Reverend looked between them, seeing the certainty in their faces, and slowly nodded. Very well, if you're sure this is what you want. It is, Matthew confirmed. He looked at Elizabeth. Unless you'd prefer to wait. Elizabeth smiled, shifting Grace in her arms. I think we've waited long enough. And so, on that clear winter morning in the Timberline Town Square, with curious townsfolk and a few genuine well-wishers as witnesses, Matthew Hayes and Elizabeth Coulter were married. The ceremony was brief, the setting unconventional, but the vows exchanged were among the most sincere Reverend Jenkins had ever heard. Where you go, I will go, Matthew recited from memory, the words of Ruth that he had practiced so carefully. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Elizabeth, tears shining in her eyes, responded with words of her own choosing. You found me when I was truly lost and led me home. Now home is wherever you are. When it was done, when the simple gold band that had once been Rebecca's was placed on Elizabeth's finger, Dr. Morgan was the first to offer congratulations, followed by Martha Coleman and a growing number of townsfolk who, seeing the genuine love between the couple, found their preconceptions falling away. They returned to Pine Ridge that afternoon, no longer as employer and housekeeper, but as husband and wife. As they approached the house, Matthew drew the horse to a halt, turning in the saddle to look at Elizabeth. Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes, he said softly. Elizabeth smiled, feeling the rightness of the name, of this place, of the life stretching before them. It's good to be home, she replied, holding Grace close as they rode the final distance to their doorstep. Spring came to Montana as it always did, reluctantly at first, like a shy bride. March brought days of deceptive warmth followed by punishing storms that reminded everyone winter hadn't surrendered yet. Chinook winds swept down from the mountains, eating away at snowdrifts only to have them replenished days later. April played her own fickle game. Mornings dawning clear and brilliant would transform by afternoon into sideways sleet that froze on contact. The world existed in a state of perpetual transition. Mud ankle-deep one day would freeze into treacherous ridges overnight, challenging man and beast alike. But gradually, with the patience that defined frontier life, the balance tipped. Snow receded up the mountainsides like a tide going out. South-facing slopes revealed themselves first, their brown expanses soon giving way to the miracle of green, tender shoots pushing through earth still cold from winter's grip. Meadows transformed into tapestries of early wildflowers. buttercups and shooting stars creating splashes of yellow and purple against new grass. The timber operation flourished with the improving conditions. Teams of horses, their winter coats beginning to shed, hauled massive loads down from cutting sites that had been inaccessible during the deepest snows. The rhythmic screech and whine of the sawmill's blade filled the valley from dawn until dusk as Matthew's crews processed the winter's cut, transforming raw logs into the precisely dimensioned lumber the railroad demanded. 3 heavily laden wagons left Pine Ridge each week for the Northern Pacific Depot and Timberline, each returning with empty beds and full payment. The April deadline came and went without crisis. Matthew presented Barrett with the bank draft covering the full balance of his loans, the evidence of fraudulent accounting compelling the banker to accept without protest. Within a fortnight, Barrett closed his affairs in Timberline and departed for parts unknown, his reputation in ruins. His schemes collapsed like a poorly built dam against the spring flood. Pine Ridge transformed with the season. Elizabeth planted a garden behind the house, vegetable rows interspersed with the wildflowers that had been Rebecca's favorite. Matthew built a small pen for chickens, fulfilling Elizabeth's wish for fresh eggs. Grace took her first steps on the wide porch, toddling from Elizabeth's arms to Matthew's waiting hands. The cradle they had built together stood empty now as Grace had graduated to a small bed in what had been Elizabeth's room. The main bedroom upstairs was now shared by Matthew and Elizabeth, their initial shyness with each other having given way to a deep physical and emotional intimacy that continued to grow with each passing day. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold, Elizabeth felt Matthew's gaze on her face. "What?" she asked, smiling at his contemplative expression. "I was just thinking," he said, reaching for her hand, "about crossroads." Elizabeth nodded, understanding immediately how a single turn can change everything. "If you hadn't been standing there that day," Matthew said softly, "if I had taken the North Fork instead of the East." "But you didn't," Elizabeth reminded him, squeezing his hand. "You found me." "We found each other," Matthew corrected gently, "both lost in our own ways." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible again after Thomas died. "Do you ever wonder about Rebecca?" she asked. "What she would think of all this?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think she would be pleased," he said finally. "She never wanted me to be alone. In her last letter to her sister, the one that arrived after she died, she wrote that her greatest fear was that I would close myself off from life if anything happened to her." "And you did," Elizabeth observed, "for 2 years." "Until a stubborn woman and her daughter appeared in a snowstorm," Matthew agreed, a smile touching his lips. "Rebecca would have liked you, Elizabeth. You have the same strength, the same clear way of seeing through to what matters." Elizabeth felt honored by the comparison, knowing what Rebecca had meant to Matthew. There was no jealousy in her heart for his first wife, only gratitude for the man Rebecca had helped shape, and for the home she had created that now sheltered them all. "I planted her favorite flowers in the garden," Elizabeth said, "so that part of her is still growing here." Matthew nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you for that." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded from the sky, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana darkness. From inside the house came the soft sounds of Grace stirring in her sleep, then settling again. "You know," Matthew said after a while, "I never asked where you were heading that day, when I found you at the crossroads." Elizabeth thought back to that desperate woman she had been, standing in the snow with no destination in mind, except away. "Nowhere," she admitted. "Anywhere. I just needed to keep moving." "And now?" Matthew asked, his eyes searching her face. Elizabeth smiled, leaning forward to kiss him gently. "Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Montana, present day. Jack Harlow finished his story, his weathered hands wrapped once more around his coffee mug. The fire had burned low in the hearth, and outside the window, a light snow had begun to fall. Timothy sat in silence, absorbing his grandfather's tale. "So Grandmother Elizabeth was the woman at the crossroads," he said finally. "And you were Matthew." Jack nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "Names change to protect the innocent," he said with a slight smile. "But the heart of it is true enough. What happened to Barrett in the town?" "Barrett went bust in the panic of '93, lost everything he'd schemed for." Jack's satisfaction at this outcome was still evident, even after all these years. "As for Timberline, well, it grew to accept us. Eventually, Your grandmother started a school on the property for the workers' children, became quite respected as a teacher again. Timothy gestured to the mantel where the faded photograph stood in its wooden frame. And that was your wedding day? In the town square? Jack nodded. Not the wedding your grandmother had dreamed of as a girl, I expect. But she claimed she wouldn't have changed a thing. And Grace, what became of her? Jack's eyes twinkled. She grew up strong and smart, just like her mother. Married a railroad engineer named Michael Sullivan. Their daughter Margaret was your mother. Timothy looked surprised. So grandmother Elizabeth wasn't actually my biological great-grandmother? Blood doesn't make a family, son, Jack said firmly. Love does. Your grandmother raised Grace as her own from that first day at the crossroads. Later, we had 4 children together, your great-uncles James and William, and great-aunts Sarah and Rebecca. He gestured towards the window where the lights of the ranch buildings could be seen through the falling snow. This land has sheltered 5 generations now. Started with a desperate woman, a widowed man, and a baby with no future. Grew into all this. Timothy followed his gaze, seeing Pine Ridge Ranch with new eyes, not just as the place he'd grown up, but as the legacy of a love story that began in a snowstorm nearly a century and a half ago. So when you say that getting lost can sometimes be the only way to find where you belong, Timothy began. I speak from experience, Jack finished with a nod. Your grandmother taught me that. Best lesson I ever learned. He rose stiffly, crossing to the mantel to touch the photograph with gentle fingers. She's been gone 15 years now, but some days I still expect to see her in the kitchen or reading in her chair by the fire. Do you miss her? Timothy asked softly. Jack turned, his eyes clear and certain. Every day. But I don't regret a single moment we had together. Not one. He glanced out the window again, where Timothy's parents and siblings could be seen returning from town, their car's headlights cutting through the snow. Love's not always an easy road, Timothy. Sometimes there are storms to weather, crossroads to navigate. But when you find the right person to travel with, he smiled, the years falling away from his face. Well, that makes all the difference. Timothy nodded, understanding something profound about his grandfather that he had never quite grasped before. The quiet strength, the unwavering loyalty, the deep capacity for love that had shaped their family for generations. All had begun with a choice made in a snowstorm, when 2 lost souls found their way home through each other. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly over Pine Ridge Ranch, covering the land in a pristine blanket of white. In the old family cemetery on the hill, 2 headstones stood side by side, partially obscured now by the gathering snow. Their inscriptions, weathered by time but still legible, read simply, Matthew Hayes, 1851, 1941, Where you go, I will go. Elizabeth Hayes, 1861 to 1946, Where you stay, I will stay. Between the graves planted long ago by loving hands, a patch of wildflowers slept beneath the snow, waiting for spring's return. The same delicate blue blooms that had once been pressed between the pages of Rebecca's Bible. In the fullness of time, they would rise again, roots intertwined, reaching toward the Montana sun in an endless cycle of renewal and hope. Just as Matthew had promised Elizabeth on that winter day at the crossroads, they had indeed found their way home, to each other and to the legacy of love that continued to flourish long after they were gone.